My name is Tommaso Ferretti, and for 32 years I worked as a forensic pathologist at the Institute of Legal Medicine in Milan. 32 years spent between the cold walls of an autopsy room, 32 years examining corpses, weighing organs, measuring wounds, collecting evidence that would solve crimes or clarify mysterious deaths. I've seen thousands of bodies. Thousands. Each with its own story. Each with its secrets hidden in tissues, coagulated blood, fractured bones. I've performed autopsies on murder victims, suicides, natural deaths, traffic accidents, drownings, charred bodies, skeletal remains found after decades. I've testified in hundreds of trials, explained to judges and juries what happens to the human body when life departs, described with surgical precision the mechanisms of death. Death, for me, no longer held secrets. It had become familiar, almost boring in its repetitiveness. I knew exactly what to expect when I opened a chest. Collapsed lungs, stiffened heart, clotted blood in the cardiac chambers. I knew the timelines of decomposition better than I knew the seasons. I knew that after 24 hours, cadaveric lividity begins. That after 48 hours, abdominal swelling starts. That after a week, internal gases begin to escape. That after a month, soft tissues liquefy. And I knew, with absolute scientific certainty, that after 13 years of burial in a wooden coffin, even under the most favorable conditions, nothing remains of a human body but a skeleton. At most, some shreds of mummified skin, some tufts of hair. This is what science teaches us. This is what I had personally verified hundreds of times, or at least, this is what I believed until January 23, 2019, the day when my scientific certainty shattered like thin glass in the face of something that medicine cannot explain. Something that shook the very foundations of my rationalism. Something that forced me to question everything I had believed for half a century. I was born in Milan on March 14, 1969, into a family where medicine flowed through the veins like blood. My father, Giuseppe Ferretti, was chief of general surgery at Niguarda Hospital, one of those old-school surgeons, golden hands and brusque temperament, who operated 12 hours a day and came home talking about appendectomies and tumors, as others talk about the weather. My mother, Elena, was a general pediatrician, with an office on Via Monte Napoleone, where she received the children of Milan's well-to-do families. My older brother, Andrea, 5 years older than me, naturally decided to become a cardiologist, following what seemed to be the family vocation: saving lives. I, however, chose a different path. I chose to study the dead, not the living. When at 18 I announced to my parents that I wanted to specialize in forensic medicine, my father looked at me as if I had said I wanted to become an undertaker. "Tommaso," he said, heavily setting down his fork on the plate during Sunday dinner, "medicine is for saving lives, not for cutting up corpses for the courts." But I was stubborn. I was fascinated by the investigative aspect of the profession, the possibility of making bodies speak, of reconstructing stories through the traces that death leaves in tissues, of bringing justice through science. A corpse, for me, was an open book written in the language of pathology, and I wanted to learn to read it. I graduated from the University of Milan in 1993 with honors, with a thesis on dating death through entomological analysis. I spent months studying fly larvae, developmental stages of necrophagous insects, decomposition temperatures. My classmates avoided me, disgusted by my conversation topics. But I didn't care. At university, I was known as the most skeptical in my class, perhaps in the entire faculty. While my companions discussed philosophy and religion in the bars of Città Studi after classes, I stayed in the pathological anatomy laboratory, studying slides under the microscope, dissecting bodies donated to science, memorizing every muscle, every blood vessel, every nerve of the human body. For me, only what I could measure, weigh, analyze under a microscope existed. The soul? a poetic concept invented by primitive peoples who didn't understand how the brain worked. God? An unnecessary hypothesis to explain the universe. Life after death? A consoling illusion for those afraid of nothingness. I was, without doubt, a convinced materialist, a biological reductionist who saw in man only a complex machine made of flesh, bones, and chemical reactions. When that machine stopped, when the heart ceased pumping blood, when neurons stopped firing electrical impulses, everything ended. There was nothing else. Consciousness shut off like a light bulb when the power is cut. The body began to decompose, atoms and molecules returned to Earth, and that was all. No heaven, no hell, no reincarnation. Only the relentless cycle of nature. After graduation, I did my specialization in forensic medicine at the University of Pavia, one of the best Italian schools for the discipline. 4 intense years, spent frequenting the morgue of San Matteo Hospital, participating in trials as an expert witness, writing scientific articles for professional journals. My advisor, Professor Umberto Bracci, was a luminary of thanatology, having taught it for 40 years. He took me under his wing, taught me not only autopsy technique, but also methodological rigor, the importance of precise documentation, the necessity of always separating facts from interpretations. Tommaso, he would tell me, a forensic pathologist must be like an impartial chronicler. Your scalpel writes the truth in the language of tissues. You must never, ever let emotions or personal beliefs influence your conclusions. I completed my specialization with top marks in 1997, and at 27 I entered as an assistant at the Institute of Legal Medicine in Milan, that same gray building on Via Luigi Mangiagalli, where I still work today. I remember the first day, June, stifling heat, the sweetish and nauseating stench of decomposition that hit me as soon as I crossed the morgue door. The first months were hard. No matter how much one prepares theoretically, the reality of dead bodies, smells, fluids, the dissolution of human flesh is something that must be confronted, overcome, integrated into one's daily routine. Some colleagues couldn't handle it, changed specialization after a few months. I, however, adapted quickly. Indeed, I found a strange peace in that work. The dead don't protest, don't complain, don't sue for malpractice. They tell you their truth in silence. It's up to you to know how to read it. Over the years, I developed a particular expertise in exhumations, those cases where, for judicial or administrative reasons, a body buried for years must be disinterred for examinations. It's delicate work that requires experience and a strong stomach. One must know what to expect, understand decomposition processes at various stages, be able to distinguish between natural post-mortem phenomena and pathological ante-mortem signs, comprehend how soil, humidity, temperature, and type of coffin influence the preservation of remains. I've done hundreds of exhumations, bodies buried for 5 years, 10, 15, 20 years, and each time it was the same predictable story. Well-preserved skeletons if the coffin was good quality, scattered bones if the wood was rotten, sometimes partially mummified remains if the soil was particularly dry or sandy. But always, always, only a shadow of what had been a living body. Decomposition is an inexorable process, governed by precise and immutable biological laws. The very moment the heart stops beating, when the last breath leaves the lungs, when the electroencephalogram flattens into a straight and silent line, dissolution begins. Cells, deprived of oxygen and nutrients carried by blood, begin to self-digest through the action of their own lysosomal enzymes. It's a process we call autolysis. Simultaneously, bacteria that normally live in our intestines, kept in check by the immune system during life, begin to multiply exponentially and invade other organs. This is the phenomenon of putrefaction. In our temperate climates, under normal conditions, the sequence is always the same. After a few hours, rigor mortis develops, cadaveric rigidity, when muscles stiffen due to the depletion of ATP, the energy molecule of cells. After 24 to 36 hours, the first hypostatic stains appear, purplish-blue areas where blood, no longer pumped by the heart, accumulates by gravity in the lower parts of the body. After 48 to 72 hours, abdominal swelling begins, caused by gases produced by intestinal bacteria. The belly distends like a balloon, sometimes literally exploding. After a week, those gases spread throughout the body, making the face swell, the tongue protrude, the eyes close, the skin takes on a greenish color, then black-violet. After 2 weeks, collocation begins, the liquefaction of soft tissues. After a month, if the body is in the open, fly larvae have completed their cycle and devoured most of the soft tissues. But when a body is buried, the timelines lengthen, even if the final destination remains unchanged. In a wooden coffin, buried 6 feet deep, decomposition proceeds more slowly because insect access is limited, and temperature is lower and more constant. Yet even in these protected conditions, after 5 years of an adult human body, mainly bones and hair remain. After 10 years, only the skeleton. After 15, even the bones begin to become fragile, porous, to crumble. The internal organs? Long gone. The heart in particular, being a hollow muscle full of blood, rich in fluids, densely vascularized, is one of the first organs to completely decompose. After a year, almost nothing remains of it. After 5 years, nothing. After 13 years, the very idea that something recognizable as a heart could exist is simply ridiculous from a scientific standpoint. My wife, Laura, whom I met during 5th year of medical school when we were both broke students sharing a margarita pizza in 2 for dinner, is a molecular biologist. She works at a genetic research laboratory at Milan's Policlinico, studying genetic mutations linked to cancers. She's an intelligent, practical woman, as rational as me. We married in 2000 when I was 31 and she was 29 in a civil ceremony at Milan City Hall. Then, to please our elderly and traditionalist parents, we consented to a church blessing, a quick little service in front of about 20 relatives. The priest asked us if we would raise our children in the Catholic faith. "Of course, Father," we replied, lying shamelessly. We had already agreed between us that we would raise our children with critical thinking and the scientific method, not with the dogmas of a religion we considered a relic of the past. We have 2 children, Alessia and Davide. Alessia, born in 2001, has always been fascinated by animals. As a child, she brought home stray cats, injured birds, hedgehogs found in the garden. Now she's 23 and studying veterinary medicine at the University of Milan, and I'm sure she'll become an excellent professional. She inherited her mother's sensitivity and her father's precision. Davide, born in 2003, is completely different, cold, logical, mathematical. At school, he excelled in physics and mathematics, while struggling with literature and philosophy. "What's the point of studying Dante, Dad?" he would ask me. "He died 700 years ago. He can't teach us anything useful for today's world." Now he's doing aerospace engineering at the Polytechnic and is happy immersed in his differential equations and fluid dynamics models. We have a normal, quiet, predictable life. On Sundays, we have lunch at my parents' house, who are now both over 80. My father, retired from surgical practice, spends his days reading medical journals and criticizing the advances of modern medicine. "In my day," he always says, "a surgeon operated with hands and intuition, not with robots." My mother, instead, has developed a late passion for gardening and spends hours caring for her hydrangeas and roses. My brother Andrea has become chief of cardiology, married to a fellow cardiologist colleague, 2 children who are also doctors. A medical dynasty, as my father proudly defines it. In summer we take vacations in Liguria, always in the same place, a small apartment in Santa Margherita Ligure that we've been renting for 20 years. Laura loves to swim. I prefer to read in the shade under the umbrella. I read a lot. Scientific essays, books on the history of medicine, biographies of great scientists. Not novels, not poetry. Fiction has never interested me. I prefer reality, facts, documentable things. We're not practicing Catholics, Laura and I. We married in church for family tradition, baptized our children because that's what you do in Italy. But faith has never been part of our daily life. On Sundays, while many Milanese go to Mass, we go out for lunch or take walks in the parks. At Christmas and Easter, just to avoid offending my elderly parents, we participate in family celebrations, but they're empty gestures, rituals without meaning. For me, life was chemistry, physics, biology, and nothing more. The soul? A poetic concept to describe the complex activity of the central nervous system. God? A superfluous hypothesis in a universe that can be perfectly explained by the laws of physics and evolution. The afterlife? A psychological consolation invented by human beings who don't accept their mortal nature, who need to believe that death isn't the end in order to bear the anguish of existence. I admit without shame, a dogmatic materialist. If I couldn't weigh it, measure it, see it under a microscope, it didn't exist for me. Consciousness? Electrochemical activity of neurons. Love? Oxytocin and dopamine. Morality? Evolution of social cooperation strategies. Beauty? Aesthetic preferences selected evolutionarily. I reduced everything, always, to physical mechanisms, and this worldview gave me security. There were no mysteries, no unanswered questions. Only scientific problems not yet solved, but potentially solvable. Or at least, that's what I thought. I remember perfectly the day I received the phone call, as one remembers certain moments that mark a watershed in life, even if at the time you don't realize it. It was January 16th, 2019, a gray and humid Wednesday afternoon, typical of Milanese winter. I was completing a particularly complex report in my office on the 4th floor of the Institute, a case of murder disguised as suicide, where I had to reconstruct the entire sequence through signs on the victim's neck. It was 4:30, almost time to go home. The phone rang with that shrill sound that has always irritated me. It was the director's secretary. "Doctor, Professor Mariani would like to see you immediately in his office." I went up to the 5th floor, wondering what the director could possibly want. Professor Giulio Mariani was a severe, rigorous man, not inclined to small talk. If he summoned you, there was always a precise reason. I knocked on his office door. "Come in." I found him seated at his enormous walnut desk, surrounded by piles of folders and reports. He was 65, completely white hair, thick glasses, always impeccable lab coat. He looked at me over his lenses. "Tommaso, sit down. I have a particular request to submit to you." I sat in the chair opposite him, intrigued. "A request from the Vatican," he continued, lifting a beige folder. "Through official channels, of course. It concerns a cadaveric examination of a body exhumed in Assisi. They contacted me personally because they were looking for a forensic pathologist with specific experience in exhumations and with an impeccable curriculum. I immediately thought of you." The Vatican? It took me by surprise. In 32 years of career, I had worked for courts, prosecutors' offices, prefectures, but never for the Catholic Church. Mariani opened the folder and began to explain the details, reading from the documents in his monotonous bureaucratic voice. "It concerns Carlo Acutis, a boy who died in 2006, at only 15 years old. Initially buried in Ternengo, then transferred to Assisi in 2007. The Church has opened the cause for beatification, and as per canonical protocol, it's necessary to verify the state of the body. The examination is scheduled for January 23rd, exactly 1 week from now. You'll be assisted by an ecclesiastical commission, But the technical scientific responsibility is entirely yours. I nodded, taking mental note. What are the expectations? I asked. Mariani looked at me with half a smile. Canonical expectations are one thing, Tommaso. Scientific expectations are another. The boy has been buried for 13 years in standard conditions. You know what that means. I knew exactly what it meant. Skeleton, perhaps some mummified remains. Nothing special. A routine examination, even if requested by the Vatican. And the compensation? I asked pragmatically. Everything regular. Payment via bank transfer from the cause's postulation. 4,000 euros for professional service, plus expense reimbursement. I accepted without particular emotion. It was a job like many others, perhaps a bit more prestigious for the client, but technically a simple post-exhumation examination. Mariani gave me the complete file with all necessary documentation. Original death certificate, ecclesiastical authorizations, exhumation decree from the Bishop of Assisi, formal request from the postulator of the beatification cause, and a biographical dossier on the young man. Read everything carefully, said Mariani, and remember, maximum scientific rigor. Your report will be scrutinized by the Vatican Medical Commission. We can't afford carelessness. Back in my office, I opened the file and began to read carefully. The death certificate, completed by San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, reported, Carlo Acutis, born May 3, 1991 in London, deceased October 12, 2006, at 6:45 a.m., cause of death. Acute promyelocytic leukemia with cerebral hemorrhagic complications. 15 years. Just 15 years. Even for a hardened person like me, the death of an adolescent always generates a certain sadness. I continued reading. Diagnosis made October 8th. Death on the 12th. 4 days. A fulminant, devastating leukemia. Poor boy, I thought mechanically, without real emotional participation. Acute promyelocytic leukemias are aggressive, but today with modern chemotherapy protocols, many patients survive. In 2006, therapies were less advanced. I also read the biographical dossier prepared by the postulator. Carlo Acutis was born in London to Italian parents, raised in Milan, attended the Jesuit high school. He was passionate about computers and information technology, had created a website about Eucharistic miracles, devout, practicing daily Mass, Eucharistic adoration. The classic type of pious boy, I thought with a bit of cynicism, probably a very religious family that had indoctrinated him from childhood. The dossier also cited some phrases attributed to him. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. To be always united with Jesus, that's my life program. Not I, but God. Pious, predictable phrases, probably embellished by family members' memories. Saints, in my opinion, were always idealized post-mortem, transformed into perfect icons, stripped of their real humanity. I closed the file. For me, it was simply a routine case, a body to examine, a report to write. I spent the following week meticulously preparing for the procedure, as I always did. I contacted the colleagues who would assist me. Dr. Stefano Bernardi was a third-year resident, 30 years old, brilliant, methodical, very technically prepared. Dr. Elena Rossi, instead, was a 40-year-old laboratory technician, expert in post-mortem sampling and preparation of histological specimens. Both had already worked with me on other exhumations, and I knew I could trust them. I personally prepared the necessary equipment. Sterile disposable lab coats, FFP3 masks to protect us from possible miasmas, nitrile gloves, shoe covers, sterilized surgical instruments in autoclave, scalpels of various sizes, surgical scissors, anatomical forceps, hemostatic forceps, rib retractors, oscillating saw for possible chest opening, Taylor's tape measures, portable scale, infrared thermometers. I also prepared the sampling kit, sterile test tubes, containers with formalin for histological samples, coded labels, cataloging cards, and of course the professional Canon EOS camera with macro lenses for detailed documentation. In forensic medicine, everything must be photographically documented, every single step. Photos are your legal protection, your guarantee of methodological rigor. On January 22nd, we left Milan by car. Stefano, Elena, and I in my SUV, plus a technician from the municipality of Assisi, one Fabio Mencacci, who would handle administrative and bureaucratic aspects. We loaded all the material in the trunk, 3 large suitcases containing equipment and instruments, and left around 10 in the morning. The journey along the A1 highway lasted about 4 hours, between moderate traffic and a brief stop at a rest area for lunch. We spoke little during the trip. Stefano drove. I watched the landscape flowing past the window. The Po Valley giving way to the first hills of Emilia, then the Apennines, then finally Umbria. Elena slept in the back seat. Fabio Mencacci, a little man in his 50s with a strong Umbrian accent, told us about the beauties of Assisi, the Basilica of St. Francis, religious tourism that represented the city's main economic source. I was little interested. Assisi for me was just the place where I had to do a job. We arrived in Assisi in the early afternoon, around 2 o'clock. The city showed itself to our eyes perched on the hill, medieval walls, red roofs, the profile of the Basilica of St. Francis dominating the landscape. It was a cold but clear day, the pale January sun illuminating the light stone of the buildings. We checked into Hotel Giotto, a 3-star hotel a few steps from the Basilica. Simple but clean rooms. We unloaded our luggage, quickly refreshed ourselves, then Stefano and I decided to make a preliminary inspection of the Sanctuary of the Renunciation, where the exhumation would take place the next day. The sanctuary is located in Assisi's historic center, a modern building constructed on a place of great Franciscan significance, the spot where, according to tradition, St. Francis stripped off his clothes before the bishop renouncing his father's wealth to embrace poverty. Inside, a collected, essential environment, with a marble altar above which there was a large wooden cross. We were received by Don Cesare Provenzi, the rector of the sanctuary, a priest in his 60s, gray hair, round glasses, kind expression. He showed us the crypt where Carlo's tomb was located. We descended a stone staircase, arrived in an environment lit by soft lights, cold, humid. The white marble tomb altar occupied the center of the crypt. Don Cesare explained that the body had been transferred there in 2019 after being exhumed a first time. It was already verified that the body was intact, he said in a reverent tone, but this new examination is for further verifications requested by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. I nodded politely while mentally taking note of every technical detail. Crypt temperature, about 12 to 13 degrees, constant. Humidity, perceptibly high, probably 70 to 80%. Ventilation, poor. Lighting, artificial, neon lights. Tomorrow morning, said Don Cesare, there will be the bishop, the postulator of the cause, Monsignor Raffaello Martinelli, 2 ecclesiastical experts, and of course you. The ceremony will begin with a prayer, then you'll proceed with opening the tomb. Ceremony, prayer. For me it was work, not ceremony, but I nodded courteously. Back at the hotel in the late afternoon, I spent a couple of hours reviewing the operational protocol with Stefano and Elena. We prepared the forms for completing the cadaveric examination report. Date, time, place, those present, external body description, anthropometric measurements, state of preservation, samples taken. Everything had to be documented with maniacal precision. In the evening, we dined together in a trattoria near the hotel, a typical Umbrian place with stone walls and lit fireplace. We ordered local dishes, bruschetta with extra virgin olive oil, strangozzi with black truffle, grilled meat. Stefano, who was a practicing believer, spoke to me with some enthusiasm about the possibility that we might find the body intact. "Doctor," he said, pouring himself red wine, "do you know there are documented cases of saints' bodies found incorrupt even after centuries? Saint Catherine, Saint Francis Xavier, Saint Bernadette?" I looked at him with my usual rational skepticism. "Stefano," I replied, cutting a piece of meat, "those cases have perfectly plausible scientific explanations. Particular environmental conditions, natural mummification, in some cases treatments with preservative substances. There's nothing supernatural. And in this specific case, believe me, after 13 years of burial, even in optimal conditions, we'll find only a skeleton. The laws of biology apply to everyone, saints or not. Bacteria don't differentiate between a saint and a sinner. Decomposition is an inexorable chemical-physical process." Elena, more pragmatic, drank a sip of water and said, "Anyway, tomorrow we'll find out. For me, it's enough to do my work correctly. Take samples if necessary, catalog them, send them to the laboratory. The rest are matters that don't concern me." She was right. We were technicians, scientists. It wasn't our job to establish whether a body was miraculously preserved or not. Our job was to observe, measure, document, report objective facts. We finished dinner talking about other cases, professional anecdotes, university gossip. Around 10 we returned to the hotel. In my room before sleeping, I reread once more the operational protocol and the dossier on Carlo Acutis. I looked at his photograph. A completely normal boy, jeans and sweatshirt, simple smile. Nothing particularly saintly in appearance. Just a teenager like many. I fell asleep thinking that the next day I would open his tomb, would see his skeletal remains, would compile my bureaucratic report, and would return to Milan to deal with more interesting cases. The morning of January 23rd. I woke at 6:30 before the alarm sounded. I had slept little and poorly, not from anxiety, but simply because the hotel mattress was uncomfortable and the room too heated. I took a hot shower, dressed carefully, dark pants, white shirt, wool sweater, jacket, and went down for breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Stefano and Elena were already there. We ate in silence. Cappuccino, brioche, orange juice. You could feel the tension in the air, that professional tension that precedes important work. At 8:30 we loaded all the material in the car and headed toward the sanctuary. It was a cold and humid morning, typical of Umbrian January. The car's thermometer showed 4 degrees. The sky was covered with compact gray clouds threatening rain. Assisi's streets were still almost deserted. Only some residents going to work. Some shopkeepers opening store shutters. We parked near the sanctuary and unloaded the suitcases with equipment. The sanctuary of the Renunciation was already open. Don Cesare greeted us at the entrance. "Good morning, doctors. Everything ready? The others are already in the crypt." We descended into the crypt carrying our suitcases. It was a collected environment, perhaps 40 square meters, vaulted ceiling, light stone walls, marble floor. In the center, the white marble tomb altar with the inscription, Carlo Acutis, 1991-2006. Around it, several people. The Bishop of Assisi, Monsignor Domenico Sorrentino, in his 60s, gray hair, purple cassock, grave but serene expression. The postulator of the cause, Monsignor Raffaello Martinelli, 70 years old, short, with thick glasses, ecclesiastical vestments. 2 medical experts appointed by the Curia, Dr. Giovanni Battista Rossi, forensic pathologist from Rome, and Dr. Marco Valli, anatomical pathologist from Perugia. A notary, Dr. Enrico Fabbri, who would record everything. 2 municipal workers with tools to open the tomb, and various assistants and priests. We greeted each other formally, with that professional coldness typical of these situations. The bishop shook my hand. "Dr. Ferretti, welcome. Thank you for being here. This is an important day for our Carlo's beatification cause. I nodded politely. Monsignor Martinelli, the postulator, handed me a folder with documents. Here you'll find the ecclesiastical authorizations, the exhumation decree, and the canonical protocol to follow. Obviously, you have complete scientific freedom, but there are some formal steps required by canonical regulations. I opened the folder and quickly scanned the documents. Everything regular: stamps, signatures, seals. I felt observed by all those expectant gazes. There was an atmosphere of reverent waiting, almost of sacredness, that contrasted with my purely technical scientific approach. For them it was an important spiritual moment, perhaps the opening of a future saint's tomb. For me it was a job like many others. I asked that those present not strictly necessary for the procedure be removed. To proceed with maximum scientific rigor, I explained in a firm tone, I need concentration and an environment as sterile as possible. I ask that only indispensable people remain. The bishop nodded. Naturally, doctor. I understand perfectly. Almost everyone left. Only the bishop remained, Monsignor Martinelli, the notary Fabri who had to record by law, the 2 medical experts, and the workers who had to physically open the tomb. 7 plus us 3. 10 people in all. Still too many by my standards, but acceptable. I put on the sterile disposable lab coat, the FFP3 mask, nitrile gloves, protective goggles. Stefano and Elena dressed the same way. We arranged the equipment on a side table they had prepared. Surgical instruments, camera, sample containers, tape measure, scale, thermometers, everything in perfect order. We can proceed, I said. The workers approached the marble altar with their equipment. Robust shears, screwdrivers, hammers, levers. The bishop raised a hand. Before beginning, if you permit, I would like to recite a brief prayer. I couldn't refuse. He knelt before the altar. The others imitated him. My assistants and I remained standing, a bit embarrassed. The bishop began to pray aloud, in Italian and not in Latin. Lord Jesus Christ, who called back to you our brother Carlo when he was still young, grant him eternal rest and let perpetual light shine upon him. Bless this examination and guide us in truth. Amen. A chorus of Amen echoed in the crypt. Then the bishop rose and nodded to the workers. Now you may proceed. The workers began working on the marble altar. It was composed of white Carrara marble slabs, heavy, sealed with cement mortar. With pneumatic shears and chisels, they began removing the mortar along the edges. The metallic and strident noise resounded in the crypt, multiplied by the echo of the stone walls. It took about 20 minutes of careful and laborious work. Then, with levers and pulleys, they lifted the upper slab. Below appeared another layer, limestone slabs. They removed them, and then finally the sealed zinc casket appeared, shiny, gray, with welded edges. On the lid a metal plaque read, Carlo Acutis, May 3, 1991, October 12, 2006. My heart beat regularly, 70 beats per minute, the normal rhythm for a man my age at rest. There was no anxiety, no apprehension. It was a scene I had lived dozens and dozens of times in my career. Exhumations, coffin openings, forensic reconstructions. Professional routine. I checked once more that Stefano and Elena were ready with instruments. Stefano had the camera around his neck, ready to document every step. Elena held open the sterile containers for any samples. "We're ready, doctor," said Stefano. I nodded. "Open it," I said to the workers with a firm voice. With special metal shears, large and robust, they began cutting the zinc seals all along the lid's perimeter. The metallic, strident, acute noise resounded in the crypt like a mechanical lament. It took 10 minutes to complete the cut. Then, with metal levers, the workers began to lift the heavy zinc lid. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the lid rose. And at that moment, I expected, as always happened in these situations, The characteristic smell of decomposition, that sweetish, nauseating, penetrating stench, impossible to describe to anyone who's never smelled it. A mixture of putrescine, cadaverine, sulfurous gases, a smell that sticks to clothes and hair and doesn't go away for days. But no such smell came. There was only a vague scent of humidity, of closed spaces, of mold, like when you open a cellar that's been sealed for years. Nothing more. Stefano looked at me over the mask with questioning eyes. He had noticed it too. Elena as well. I approached the edge of the zinc casket and looked inside. Inside there was, as per standard protocol, a wooden coffin. A simple coffin, of dark wood, probably oak or chestnut, with a metal cross on the lid. "Open this too," I ordered. The workers removed the screws that fixed the wooden coffin lid. There were 8 screws, 1 per corner and 4 along the sides. They removed them one by one, slowly, with an electric screwdriver that emitted a monotonous buzz. Then, with gloved hands, they lifted the wooden lid, and all of us, simultaneously, held our breath. The body was there. Not skeletal. Not reduced to bones and some shreds of mummified tissue. Intact. There was a human body recognizable as such. It wore a tracksuit, seemed to be Adidas or Nike brand, red and white, with blue inserts. Long sleeves, the logo visible on the chest, pants from the same tracksuit, white sneakers on the feet. The hands were composed on the chest, one over the other, in prayer position. The face was visible. Brown hair, rather long, still on the head. The skin had a dark coloration, tending toward leather brown, the classic pigmentation of natural mummification. But it was skin, not bare bones. The eyes were closed, eyelids lowered, the nose intact, lips sealed, jaw in natural position, not hanging, ears present. It was a body dead for 13 years, but a body. "Holy Madonna," murmured one of the workers. The bishop made the sign of the cross. Monsignor Martinelli had tears in his eyes. The 2 medical experts approached, as incredulous as me. I remained motionless for several seconds, paralyzed not by emotion but by scientific shock. This shouldn't be possible. After 13 years of burial, even in the best imaginable conditions, a body is reduced substantially to skeleton. Soft tissues decompose rapidly. They're the first to go. Skin liquefies, muscles disintegrate, internal organs transform into putrid slime, then dry out, then vanish. Bones remain, always. This is the law of thanatology. This is science. This is what I had seen in hundreds of previous exhumations. Yet what I had before me contradicted everything. I approached the coffin, bending over the body. The smell. No smell of putrefaction. Only that vague humidity, that scent of closed space. I touched with gloved fingers the body's arm. The consistency, hard, rigid, similar to leather or wood. The classic consistency of natural mummification when bodily fluids evaporate and tissues dry completely, becoming similar to parchment. But the point was this: there shouldn't be mummification in these conditions. Natural mummification requires specific environmental conditions: very dry air, constant temperature, absence of humidity, a desert, for example, or a glacier, or an acidic bog. But a humid crypt in Umbria? Impossible. Logic dictates that in a humid environment, decomposition is faster, not slower. Humidity favors bacterial proliferation, accelerates putrefaction. "Stefano," I said, with a voice that betrayed for the first time a slight uncertainty. "Start photographing. Everything, every angle. Use the flash. Complete illumination." Stefano began taking photos, the flash cyclically illuminating the crypt. Click, flash, click, flash. The notary wrote feverishly in his report. I began the external examination following the standard protocol I had followed 1,000 times. Measurement of total body length. I positioned the tape measure from head to feet. 175 centimeters. Compatible with anthropometric measurements recorded at the time of death. Weight. Impossible to detect without completely moving the body from the coffin, and at that moment I didn't want to move it. Description of skin coloration. Dark brown, uniform over all visible body. Typical pigmentation of mummification. State of clothing preservation. Tracksuit in good condition. Resistant synthetic fabric. Colors still distinguishable. State of hair preservation. Present, brown, length about 10 centimeters, not thinning. Facial examination. Symmetrical. Nose intact. Earlobes present. Eyelids closed. Mouth closed. Chin well defined. While I mentally compiled these observations that I would later transcribe in the official report, my rational brain desperately sought explanations. Perhaps, I thought, the body had been treated with preservative substances before burial. But no, the documents explicitly attested that there had been no embalming. Then perhaps the coffin had been hermetically sealed, creating an anaerobic environment that had slowed decomposition. But even this didn't explain such intact preservation after 13 years. Perhaps the body had been kept in a refrigerator before original burial? No, the timelines were documented. Death on October 12th, funeral on the 14th, immediate burial. Perhaps natural substances in the coffin would? Absurd. Perhaps the subsoil had particular chemical characteristics. I would have to analyze soil samples, but even so it seemed improbable. Doctor, the bishop's voice brought me back to reality. The Ecclesiastical Commission has authorized, if you deem it scientifically necessary, opening the body to verify the state of internal organs. I turned to look at him. Your Excellency, I said, voice slightly constricted, opening a body in these conditions would normally require an equipped operating room, specific instruments, a controlled sterile environment, but he gently interrupted me. Doctor, here in the adjacent wing of the crypt we've prepared a room that meets all sanitary requirements. We followed the indications provided by the Institute of Legal Medicine. If you deem it appropriate to proceed, everything is ready. I hesitated. On one hand, my scientific curiosity was at its peak, burning, irresistible. What would I find inside that impossible body? Would the organs be mummified, liquefied, disappeared? On the other hand, I felt a strange emotional reticence, a sensation I had never experienced before in 32 years of profession, as if I were about to violate something sacred, untouchable. But this was irrational, I told myself. I was a doctor, a scientist. Bodies are organic matter subject to biological processes. There's nothing sacred in a cadaver from a scientific viewpoint. It was just dead flesh, even if strangely preserved. And I had to understand why. I had to know. Science had to know. Agreed. I finally nodded. Let's proceed with the autopsy, but with maximum attention. This is an extremely anomalous case and requires scrupulous documentation. With the help of the workers and under the reverent gaze of all present, we delicately moved the body from the coffin to a stretcher. It was rigid, completely rigid, not from rigor mortis, obviously, that disappears after 48 hours, but from tissue mummification. We transported it to the adjacent wing of the crypt where they had indeed set up an improvised but functional operating room, a stainless steel autopsy table, professional surgical lights, surgical carts with sterile instruments, a sink, biological waste containers, forced ventilation through a portable aerator. They had done professional work, I had to admit. We positioned the body on the autopsy table. I turned on the surgical lights, directed the light beams on the thorax. Stefano positioned himself at the side with the camera, Elena on the other side with the containers for samples. I breathed deeply. In 32 years of career, I had performed over 2,000 autopsies. This was just the 2001st. Yet my hands trembled slightly as I took the scalpel from the surgical cart. "Shake off this nonsense," I told myself mentally. "You're a professional. Do your job." I began with the standard thoracic incision, the one every forensic pathologist knows and has performed hundreds of times. The classic Y incision. The scalpel started from the left shoulder, descended obliquely toward the center of the thorax at the level of the sternum. Then from the right shoulder, same oblique movement toward the center. The two incisions met at the center of the thorax, forming a V. From that point, a single vertical incision descended along the midline of the abdomen to the pubis. The scalpel sank into the mummified skin with some resistance, like cutting thick leather. Below, muscle tissues appeared dark brown, almost black, desiccated, but still anatomically distinguishable. No liquid flowed from the cut, no putrefactive slurry, only dry, compact, mummified tissue. "Instruments for opening the thorax," I asked. Elena handed me the rib shears, a robust surgical instrument similar to large scissors used to cut ribs. I began cutting the costal cartilages along the sternum, from the first to the 8th rib, first the right side, then the left. Click, click, click. The dry sound of mummified bone breaking. Then, with a rib retractor, I lifted the sternum and rib cage, completely opening the thorax like opening a book. And I stopped. The heart was there. Not a mummified residue. Not an indistinct black stain. Not collapsed tissue. The heart was there, in the thoracic cavity, in its correct anatomical position, between the two lungs, slightly inclined to the left. And it didn't look like a heart dead for 13 years. The dimensions were practically normal, perhaps slightly reduced, but not collapsed. The shape was the correct one of a human heart, pyramidal, with the apex directed downward and to the left. The coloration was reddish, not brown, not black, not gray. Reddish, like coagulated blood. The surface had an appearance shiny, almost moist, as if there were still liquid in the tissues. "It's not possible," I whispered. Stefano was pale. Elena had put down the instruments on the cart and brought a hand to her mouth. I heard behind me the two medical experts approaching. "Dr. Ferretti," said Dr. Rossi with an incredulous voice. "Let me see better." I made room for him. He observed carefully, then turned to Dr. Valli. "Marco, come see this. It's impossible." Dr. Valli also approached, looked, turned pale. "After 13 years, the heart should be completely decomposed. This doesn't make scientific sense." With hands that now trembled visibly, I took an infrared thermometer from the cart. First, I measured the ambient temperature of the thoracic cavity, 12 degrees Celsius, normal for a cold environment like that crypt. Then I aimed the thermometer directly at the heart, waiting for the digital display to stabilize, 14 degrees. Then I repeated the measurement to be sure. Still 14 degrees. 2 degrees difference from the surrounding environment. It didn't mean anything in itself, I told myself. It could be an instrument error. It could be due to different thermal conductivity of tissues. It could be a random fluctuation. But still that data was there, registered, documented. A heart that after 13 years of burial was 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding environment. "Doctor," said Stefano with a trembling voice, "should I photograph?" I nodded mechanically. Stefano began taking close-up photos of the heart, from every angle. The flash illuminated that impossible muscle. I had to proceed. I had to examine it more closely. I had to understand. With a smaller scalpel, a precision surgical scalpel with number 15 blade, I delicately incised the pericardium, the fibrous membrane that wraps the heart like a sack. The tissue yielded easily under the scalpel, and when I opened the pericardium and retracted it with 2 surgical forceps, the heart appeared completely exposed. It was anatomically perfect. I distinguished the two upper atria, the two lower ventricles. I saw the coronary arteries running on the surface, like red rivers on a geographical map. I distinguished the aorta departing from the left ventricle, thick, robust. I saw the pulmonary artery, the superior and inferior vena cava entering the right atrium. Everything was there. Everything was in its place. Everything was recognizable. There was no structural collapse typical of decomposition. There was no tissue liquefaction. There was no cellular disintegration. With anatomical forceps, Adson forceps with teeth, I gently lifted the apex of the heart, the lower point, to observe the posterior wall. The tissue yielded. It yielded like elastic tissue, not like rigid mummified tissue. There was a certain flexibility, a certain softness. Shit, I murmured under my breath, forgetting where I was. The bishop didn't seem offended. He too was too shocked by what we were seeing. It's as if it were still alive, he whispered. Don't say nonsense, Your Excellency, I retorted automatically, but my voice had no conviction. It's been dead for 13 years. Clinically, biologically, definitively dead. It's just a phenomenon of anomalous preservation that I can't explain. I had to take a sample. I had to analyze that tissue in the laboratory. It was the only way to understand. With a new, sterile scalpel, I took a small section of myocardial tissue from the wall of the left ventricle, a fragment of about 1 square centimeter, a few millimeters thick. The scalpel sank as in tissue, fresh. I found no other word. Not dry, not mummified, almost fresh. And from the cut something came out. Not liquid blood, obviously, but a reddish liquid, dense, viscous, like coagulated blood but not completely dried. Elena immediately collected it in a sterile tube, sealed the tube, applied the label with identification code, date, and time. It needs to be sent to the laboratory immediately, she said with controlled voice. Histological analysis, electron microscopy, residual water dosage, protein analysis, carbon-14 dating if possible. I continued the examination of other organs, trying to regain my professionalism, my scientific coldness. The lungs were partially collapsed but recognizable. Dark color, rubbery consistency. The liver was mummified but intact in form, positioned correctly in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen. The spleen present. The kidneys present in place. The stomach empty, collapsed. The intestine present. The bladder empty. All organs were there. All were preserved in a state that after 13 years of normal burial simply shouldn't exist. But it was the heart. It was always the heart to which my eyes returned. That heart that seemed to still guard against every law of biology, against every scientific certainty. A shadow, an echo, an impossible fragment of life. I also took samples of other tissues for comparison. Lung, liver, pectoral muscle, skin. All catalogued, all labeled, all sealed in sterile tubes. Then, with steadier hands now that the technical procedure brought me back toward the comforting territory of protocol, I sutured the body. Complete suture of the thoracic wall with surgical stitches, suture of the abdominal wall, skin recomposition. It took an hour. When I finished, the body had a long Y-shaped scar on the thorax, but it was recomposed, presentable. We dressed it again with the tracksuit. We placed it back in the coffin. The workers sealed the wooden coffin, sealed the zinc casket, repositioned the stone slabs, cemented the marble altar. It was finished. The autopsy was finished. But nothing inside me was finished. Everything had begun. We returned to the hotel in silence. Stefano and Elena were as shocked as I was. That evening in the hotel restaurant, we tried to rationalize. Particular environmental conditions, proposed Stefano. The crypt, the microclimate, perhaps particular substances in the coffin wood. But we all knew these were weak hypotheses. I had seen hundreds of exhumations in similar or even more favorable conditions for preservation. Never had I seen anything like this. "And that liquid in the heart?" asked Elena. "We have to wait for the analyses," I replied. "But even if it's just mummification liquid, the tissue consistency remains inexplicable. The myocardium after 13 years should be dry, friable, not elastic. We ate little. That night I slept poorly. I kept seeing that heart, shiny, red, almost alive. Back in Milan, I immediately sent the samples to our histology laboratory and to the biochemistry department. I requested priority analyses. Meanwhile, I began writing the official report. But how to describe what I had seen? I used technical, cold, scientific terms. Myocardial tissue in state of anomalous preservation. Absence of standard putrefactive phenomena. Presence of unexplained intracellular liquid. I carefully avoided words like impossible or inexplicable. A scientific report must be objective. Days passed. I tried to return to routine, but I couldn't concentrate on other cases. Every cadaver I opened reminded me of what I had seen in Assisi. Every dead and rigid heart I examined brought me back to that heart that seemed to still hold a breath of life. I talked to Laura. I told her everything. She, as a biologist, was equally perplexed. "Tommaso, human tissues can't preserve themselves like that without specific treatments. You need controlled conditions, embalming, chemical substances. In normal burial, after 13 years, the heart should be practically non-existent." I began researching. I read scientific articles on body preservation, natural mummification, anomalous preservation phenomena. I discovered that there were documented cases of bodies found intact even after decades, usually in extreme environmental conditions. Ice, acidic bogs, deserts, but the heart. The heart was always the most perishable organ, rich in blood, in moisture, in bacteria. The first to decompose, always. The histological analysis results arrived. I opened them with trembling hands. Dr. Giancarlo Fontana, head of the laboratory, had written me a note in the margin. "Tommaso, these results are anomalous. I'd like to repeat the analyses." The myocardial cells showed a partially preserved structure. Cell membranes were recognizable. Water content was 18%, much higher than the 2 to 3% typical of mummification. Structural proteins showed less degradation than expected. "Dr. Fontana," I called him immediately, "how do you explain this data?" He sighed. "I don't explain it, Tommaso. It's contrary to everything we know about thanatology. The only hypothesis is that the body was treated with preservative substances before burial. But from your notes, it appears there was no embalming." No embalming. Standard burial, 2006. Wooden coffin, sealed zinc." I called other colleagues discreetly. I forwarded the photos and data to a professor of forensic medicine in Bologna without specifying whose body it was. His response was terse. "If this data is authentic, we're facing a phenomenon that has no current scientific explanation. I would suggest further investigations, but with these premises, I'd say we're talking about anomalous preservation of unknown type." Weeks passed. I sent the official report to the Ecclesiastical Commission. I wrote, with maximum possible intellectual honesty, that the state of preservation of the body, and in particular of the heart, was significantly anomalous compared to scientific expectations, and that further studies would be necessary to understand the mechanisms of such preservation. I avoided the word miracle. It wasn't my job, but I also avoided giving explanations I didn't have. I began reading about Carlo Acutis' life, not out of faith, but out of scientific curiosity. I wanted to understand who this boy was. I discovered he had a particular devotion to the Eucharist, that he always said, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven," that he had made a website about Eucharistic miracles. And one phrase struck me particularly. He said that, "To be always united with Jesus, that's my life program." United with Jesus, the body of Christ, the Eucharist, the heart. For the first time in my life, I began to question myself. Certainly not about faith, that was still distant, but about the limitations of my certainty. For 32 years I had believed I had answers for everything. I had reduced man to chemistry and biology. I had derided those who spoke of soul, of spirit, of transcendence. And now, faced with that impossible heart, all my certainties wavered. One March evening, returning home from the Institute, I passed by the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie. I don't know why, but I entered. The church was almost empty. I sat in a pew in the back. I looked at the crucifix on the altar. And for the first time in decades, I asked myself a question. What if I was wrong about everything? I didn't pray. I wouldn't even know how. But I stayed there in silence for an hour. Laura noticed the change. "Tommaso, since you came back from Assisi, you're different," she told me one evening. "I seem different because I'm confused," I replied. "My whole life I believed science had answers to everything. And now I've seen something science doesn't explain. And this scares me, Laura. It scares me because if science doesn't explain this, what else doesn't it explain?" She hugged me. "Maybe not everything is explainable. Maybe there's room for mystery." "But I spent a lifetime denying mystery," I said. "It's never too late to change," she replied. In the following months, I began a journey. Not a conversion, not yet, but an opening. I started attending a group of believing doctors who met once a month to discuss science and faith. At first I went as a skeptical observer, but little by little, listening to their stories, their reflections, I began to understand that faith and reason aren't enemies. That science explains the how, but not always the why. I returned to Assisi in October, this time alone, without white coat and scalpel. I went to pray before Carlo's tomb. Or rather, I tried to pray. The words didn't come. But I stayed there kneeling, before that 15-year-old boy who had taught me that life is bigger than death, that the heart is more than the pump that circulates blood. On October 10, 2020, Carlo Acutis was beatified. I watched the ceremony on television. When the bishop pronounced the formula, "He is blessed," I thought of that heart I had held in my hands. That heart that science doesn't explain. That heart that perhaps, I say perhaps, truly held something greater than matter. Today, 5 years later, I'm still a forensic pathologist. I still do autopsies. I still open bodies. But I've changed. I haven't suddenly become a fanatical believer. Faith is a slow journey, full of doubts and questions. But I've learned humility. I've learned that there are things we cannot explain. I've learned that reducing man to chemistry and biology is scientific arrogance. Sometimes I pick up the photos from that day in Assisi again. I look at that impossible heart, and I wonder if Carlo, with his heart that seemed to still beat after 13 years, didn't want to leave us a message. A simple but powerful message. That love is stronger than death. That whoever lives united with Christ, even the body bears the sign. That eternal life is not just a theological concept, but a reality that can leave traces even in matter. I don't know if what I saw in Assisi was a miracle. I'm not a theologian, I can't say. But I know it was something that changed my life. Something that opened my eyes to dimensions of existence I was ignoring. Something that made me more humble, more open, more capable of wonder. Science is wonderful, I don't deny it. I continue to believe in the scientific method, in proofs, in evidence. But I've understood that science isn't everything. That there are realities that escape the microscope and scalpel. That man's heart isn't just a 300-gram muscle, but the symbol of something deeper. The capacity to love, to believe, to hope. Carlo Acutis lived only 15 years, but in those 15 years he left an imprint that crosses decades. His body found intact, his heart impossibly preserved, his life totally given, and I, skeptical and rational doctor, was one of the witnesses of this mystery. When I now perform an autopsy, when I open a thorax and see a dead, rigid, cold heart, I always think of that other heart. And I tell myself, perhaps death isn't the last word. Perhaps whoever lives in love lives forever. Not only spiritually, but in a way that leaves traces even in flesh. I know many colleagues would laugh if they read these words. Old Tommaso Ferretti, the convinced materialist, now talking about mystery and love stronger than death. But I saw. I touched with my own hands. I measured, photographed, analyzed, and I didn't find scientific answers. I only found an immense question. What if there really is something beyond matter? Laura and I now go to Mass on Sundays. Not always, not with fanatical regularity. But we go. Our children affectionately tease us. Mom and Dad have become religious. But it's not a matter of religion. It's a matter of openness, of willingness to let oneself be questioned by mystery, of accepting that not everything is explainable. I'm 70 years old now. In a few years I'll retire. And when my moment comes, when my heart stops beating, I wonder what will remain of me. Perhaps only bones, as for most men. Or perhaps, if I've learned to love like Carlo, if I've lived united with something greater than myself, perhaps my body too will bear the sign of that life. I don't know. Nobody knows. But that morning of January 23, 2019, in Assisi, I glimpsed something. I saw that the boundaries between life and death, between matter and spirit, between science and faith, are more blurred than I believed. I saw a heart that after 13 years seemed to still hold a breath of life. And this is enough for me to continue searching, questioning myself, hoping. Science taught me to observe, to measure, to doubt. But Carlo Acutis taught me something more precious. He taught me to marvel. And in wonder, perhaps, is the beginning of faith. If this story has touched your heart and made you reflect on the mystery of life and death, subscribe to the channel to discover other extraordinary testimonies about Carlo Acutis' life. Leave a like and activate the bell to not miss the next stories that illuminate our faith.